She was everything they laughed at. He was everything they wanted. And when the fire came, only one of them knew how to save a town. If you think you know how this story ends, stay with me, because the people of Red Hollow thought they knew too. Drop the name of your city in the comments below and hit that like button so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning Colt Mercer rode back into Red Hollow. After 3 weeks on the trail, half the town already knew he was coming. Word traveled fast in a settlement that size. A rider had passed through the evening before, stopped at Haggerty's feed store long enough to mention he'd seen Colt's outfit moving through the canyon pass. And by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline, there were at least 4 families who had already decided what dress their daughters would wear to the social that Saturday. Red Hollow in 1883 was not a large place. It sat in a valley between 2 low mountain ranges in the Wyoming Territory, the kind of town that had grown up fast around a rail spur and a livestock market and hadn't quite figured out what it was supposed to be yet. There were maybe 400 people if you counted the outlying ranches and the handful of homesteaders still trying to break soil on the flats north of town. There was a general store, a bank, a physician who was better at setting bones than treating fever, 2 churches that didn't speak to each other, and 1 hotel that served meals. What Red Hollow did not have, and what everyone seemed to feel the absence of most keenly, was a family at its center, a name that meant something, the kind of household that other households organized themselves around. Colt Mercer was the closest thing to it, and he wasn't even married. He was 31 years old, which in frontier terms meant he had outlasted most of the dangers that tended to kill younger men and hadn't yet acquired the weathered resignation that came to older ones. He was not handsome in any theatrical way. His nose had been broken at least once. There was a scar along his jaw from a wire fence accident he didn't talk about, and he squinted slightly in bright light from years of riding into the sun. But he sat a horse well. He was known to be fair in his dealings, and the Mercer Ranch ran 11,000 acres of good grazing land with a small but reliable cattle operation that had survived 2 bad winters in a row. In a place like Red Hollow, that combination of qualities was worth more than any amount of physical beauty. He had money, or at least the frontier version of it. He had land. He had a reputation for keeping his word. And he was, as far as anyone could determine, not attached to any woman in particular. This last fact was treated as something close to a civic emergency by certain families in town. Margaret Aldridge was the first one to spot him coming down the main road that Tuesday morning, and she did not waste any time. She turned from the window of her parlor, called her daughter Cecilia's name in a tone that communicated urgency without quite crossing into rudeness, and by the time Colt had tied his horse outside the surveyor's office, Cecilia Aldridge was standing on the front porch of the family home in a clean dress with her hair done. Colt tipped his hat. He was polite. He was always polite. He said good morning, asked how the family was keeping, and walked into the surveyor's office. Cecilia Aldridge was 19, had been told her entire life that she was beautiful, and had never been dismissed that casually by anyone. She went back inside and told her mother the man was impossible. Her mother said that was fine, that impossible men sometimes just needed more time. She was wrong about that, but she didn't know it yet. The Mercer Ranch sat about 4 miles east of town, up a gradual slope that gave it a view of the valley below and caught a decent breeze in summer. Colt had inherited it from his father 8 years earlier, along with a modest amount of debt and an aging foreman named Ike Dutton, who had worked the land since before Colt was born. He'd spent the better part of those 8 years paying off the debt, rebuilding the fencing, and establishing the kind of working relationships with buyers and transport outfits that a small operation needed to survive. He wasn't rich, not by the standards that word usually implied, but he was solvent, which in 1883 Wyoming was as close to security as most people got. His closest associate in town was a man named Douglas Webb, who ran the livestock brokerage out of a cramped office next to the hotel and had known Colt since they were both considerably younger and considerably less sensible. Douglas was married with 3 children and had what Colt privately thought of as a settled quality. Not complacent, exactly, but anchored in a way that Colt wasn't. They shared a drink together most Fridays when Colt came in for supplies, and Douglas had been making variations on the same comment for the past 2 years. "You can't run that place alone forever," Douglas said, the second Friday in October, sliding a glass across the bar in the back corner of the hotel dining room where they usually sat. You need somebody. I've got Ike, Colt said. Ike is 63 years old and his knees give out in cold weather. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Colt didn't answer right away. He looked at his drink. The Aldridge girl keeps asking about you, Douglas said. I know. She's not bad. Family's got connections with the Cheyenne buyers. You could do worse on practical grounds alone. She spent 20 minutes at the Harvest Social last month telling me about her piano lessons, Colt said. I don't have anything against piano lessons. I just don't have anything to say about them either. Douglas laughed despite himself. Well, what do you want to talk about? Colt thought about it for longer than the question probably deserved. I don't know exactly. Something real, I guess. Douglas gave him a look that suggested this was both a reasonable and entirely unhelpful answer. Mara Quinn had lived in Red Hollow for 6 years, which was long enough to be known and not quite long enough to be fully accepted, which in a frontier town amounted to roughly the same social position as a piece of furniture that everyone had stopped noticing. She had come out from Ohio at 22 with her mother, who had died of pneumonia in the first winter, and she had stayed because there was nowhere obvious to go back to, and because she had managed, against most reasonable expectations, to build something resembling a livelihood. She rented 2 rooms above the harness shop on the east end of Main Street, the cheaper end, away from the hotel and the bank. And she did sewing. She was good at it. Better than good. In the way that people are sometimes good at things they fell into rather than things they chose. She could take apart a garment, understand its construction, and put it back together with improvements the original maker hadn't thought of. She did alterations, repairs, and occasionally made pieces from scratch for families who needed them. She kept her prices low because most of her customers couldn't afford anything else. She was 28 years old, medium height, with dark hair she kept pinned back practically, and eyes the color of creek water on an overcast day, brown with green in it, neither one thing nor the other. She was, by the social standards of Red Hollow, what was called plain, which was a word that covered a wide range of sins in a community that judged women primarily by 2 things, their appearance and their family connections. Mara had neither in the forms that counted. She was also, and this was perhaps the thing people noticed least about her, genuinely intelligent in a specific and practical way. The kind of intelligence that assessed situations quickly, found the workable path through, and didn't waste time on the alternatives. Most people in Red Hollow didn't know that about her because most people in Red Hollow hadn't had a real conversation with her. She was, in the particular cruelty of small communities, visible and invisible at the same time. People knew who she was. They brought her their torn sleeves and their children's outgrown dresses and their husbands' worn-through trouser knees, and they paid her whatever she asked without argument because she was cheap and reliable and never complained about the condition of the work. But they did not invite her to things. They did not save her a seat at social gatherings. They did not, for the most part, wonder very much about what her life was like. The women who competed most fiercely for Colt Mercer's attention found Mara Quinn mildly amusing in the specific way that people find something amusing when it poses no threat to them. She was a seamstress who lived above a harness shop and mended other people's worn-out things. The idea that she could be relevant to their ambitions would have struck them as not just wrong, but genuinely funny. This was, as it turned out, a significant miscalculation. The first time Colt spoke to Mara, really spoke to her, beyond the transaction of paying for work, was in mid-October, on a Tuesday afternoon when he had stopped by to pick up a jacket she'd repaired for him. The lining had come loose along the shoulder seam, a thing his foreman Ike had done by moving too quickly in cold weather, and Colt had dropped it off the week before. He came in, she brought the jacket out from the back room, he looked it over. The repair was clean. Better than clean. She had reinforced the whole seam, not just the section that had failed, which he noticed. "You fixed more than I asked for," he said. She glanced up from folding something at the counter. "The other sections were going the same way. Figured it was easier to do it now." "You could have charged me more." "I didn't do more work than the original price covered." She said it simply, not defensively, just as a statement of fact. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to, which was not something he usually did. "You're Mara Quinn," he said. "I am." "Colt Mercer." "I know who you are," she said. She didn't say it rudely, but she said it in a way that made it clear she wasn't going to make something out of the introduction. Wasn't going to brighten or adjust her posture or do any of the small performance adjustments that most people did when they said his name back to him. He found himself oddly relieved by that. "The jacket looks good," he said. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She had already turned back to her work. He left. He thought about that exchange 3 times before he got back to the ranch, which was 2 more times than he thought about most conversations. He came back the following week with a vest that needed a button replaced, which was not actually a job that required him to bring it in person. He could have sent Ike or dropped it over the counter while conducting other business in town, but he brought it himself. Mara replaced the button while he waited, which took about 7 minutes, and they talked during those 7 minutes about the weather coming in off the mountains, which she seemed to actually have opinions about based on observation rather than just filling silence, and about a family named the Rourkes on the North Flats, who had lost most of their winter stores to a flooding root cellar, who she mentioned in the context of explaining why she'd been busy that week, making up basic shirts for the children out of donated material. "Who organized that?" he asked. "I did, mostly. Mrs. Haynes helped with the fabric donation." "Does that happen a lot? Families in that kind of situation?" She looked at him with an expression that suggested she wasn't sure if the question was genuine or rhetorical. "Yes," she said. "It happens a lot, more than people talk about." He nodded slowly. "The Rourkes. I know that name. The father, James Rourke, he did some work for a neighbor of mine a few years back. Good worker." "He is," she said. "He just had a bad run of luck, like people do." She handed him the vest. He paid her. He stood at the counter for a moment after the money changed hands. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She waited. "What do you think about when you're working, when it's just you in here and you're doing the sewing?" It was a strange question, and he knew it was a strange question when he asked it, but something about the way she moved through her work, quietly, without apparent boredom, focused, made him curious about what went on behind it. She considered the question with the same directness she brought to everything else. "I think about the person whose thing I'm fixing," she said. "What they need it for. Whether the fix is going to hold. I think about the construction, why whoever made it did it the way they did. Sometimes I think about other things, problems." She paused. "Why?" "I don't know exactly," he said. "I was just wondering." He left again. He thought about her the whole drive home. By the time he'd been back 4 times in 6 weeks, each time with something that needed work, though at least 2 of those things could reasonably have waited, Douglas Webb had noticed and said so. "You're in there twice a week," Douglas said. "How many things do you own that need fixing?" "Ranch work is hard on clothes," Colt said. "Colt." "What?" "Mara Quinn." Douglas said her name with a particular careful neutrality that meant he was trying to gauge the situation rather than judge it. "That's where you've been going." Colt didn't deny it. "She's—" He stopped, started again. "Have you ever talked to her? Actually talked to her?" "I've said hello." "She's different from most people around here." Douglas was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man doing careful social arithmetic. "Different how?" "She says what she means. She doesn't perform. When she talks to you, she's talking to you, not at you, not around you. She actually thinks about things." He paused. "She's interesting." "She's also the woman who lives above the harness shop and mends clothes for a living," Douglas said, not unkindly. "You know how this town is, the moment you show any kind of interest. I know how this town is. I'm not saying don't. I'm saying be clear with yourself about what you're doing before it goes any further." Douglas looked at him steadily. "Because the way you just talked about her, it's already further than you think." Colt didn't answer that directly, but he knew Douglas was right. The conversation that shifted things, that moved it from something he was circling privately to something real and acknowledged between them, happened on a cold afternoon in November when he arrived at her shop just before closing and found her not at her usual place behind the counter, but sitting on the floor in the back room, surrounded by pieces of a winter coat she was reconstructing for a woman named Elsa Brandt, whose husband had died the previous spring. He knocked, she called for him to come in, and he found her cross-legged on the floor with pieces of wool broadcloth arranged around her in some system he didn't immediately understand. "Sorry," she said, not getting up. "I'm in the middle of something and I'll lose the layout if I stand." "Don't," he said. I can wait. He leaned against the doorframe. What are you doing? She explained. The coat was too small for Mrs. Brandt, and it had been the only winter coat she had. Her husband's coat reworked as best she could into something wearable. But the original modification had been done badly, and it was pulling at the shoulders and restricting her movement. Mara was taking it apart and redoing it properly. But to do that, she needed to understand the original construction first, which was why the pieces were spread out in order on the floor. Like a map of the thing before it was the thing. He sat down on the floor across from her while she talked, which surprised her. He could see that, but she didn't comment on it. How do you know where everything goes when you put it back? He asked. I remember it, and I marked the pieces. She pointed to small chalk marks along the seam edges. But mostly, I remember. You can hold the whole shape of it in your head. Yes. He looked at the pieces for a moment. That's a useful thing to be able to do. It has its applications, she said dryly. He laughed, which surprised her again. She looked up at him with an expression that was almost caught off guard, like she hadn't expected the laugh and didn't quite know what to do with it. I like talking to you, he said, simple and direct, because that was how she seemed to prefer things. She looked at him for a moment. You don't really know me. I'm trying to. Another pause. She set down the piece of cloth she was holding. Why? And here was the thing about Mara Quinn that he was learning. She asked direct questions, and she wanted direct answers, and she had no patience for the kind of evasive social warmth that most conversations in Red Hollow ran on. She would wait for a real answer as long as it took, and she would know if she wasn't getting one. Because you're the most honest person I've met in this county, he said, and honest is harder to find than people think. She looked at him for a long time, not suspicious exactly, but careful, like someone checking the ground before they stepped on it. That's a reasonable answer, she finally said. High praise. It was meant as such, she said, and she almost smiled when she said it, just the edge of one, and he thought that was probably worth more than most full smiles he'd seen. He didn't tell anyone what was developing between them, not deliberately keeping it secret, but not announcing it either, which in a town the size of Red Hollow was ultimately no different from the same thing. People noticed anyway. The first person to say something directly was not Douglas, but Margaret Aldridge, who encountered Colt at the general store in late November and said, in the tone of someone making an observation that was not really an observation, that she'd seen him coming out of the Quinn girls' shop quite a few times lately. I use her services, Colt said. Of course, Margaret said. A pause. Cecilia is hosting a small gathering next Saturday. I hope you'll consider coming. I'll see about my schedule. He did not go to the gathering. The second person was a man named Harlan Cross, who ran one of the larger cattle operations in the valley and had been doing business with the Mercer Ranch on and off for 3 years. Harlan was in his mid-50s, well established, and had a particular manner that Colt had always found slightly wearing, the manner of a man who believed that his success gave him a natural authority to comment on other people's choices. They ran into each other outside the hotel one afternoon in December. Harlan stopped, looked at Colt in a speculative way, and said he'd heard some talk. There's always talk, Colt said. Talk about you and the Quinn woman. Colt waited. I'm going to give you some plain advice, Harlan said, because I've known your family since before you were old enough to make your own decisions, and I think plain is better than soft here. That woman is not the right choice for a man in your position. Setting aside everything else, the look of things, what people will say, she has nothing to bring to a partnership. No connections, no resources, no standing. I wasn't aware I'd asked for advice, Colt said. Harlan's expression shifted slightly. Think about what you're building. You've got a good operation. The connections you've got with my outfit and with the Western buyers, those relationships matter. People are watching how you conduct yourself. I expect they are, Colt said. He looked at Harlan steadily. I appreciate the concern. He walked away. Harlan Cross watched him go with the expression of a man who had not said everything he intended to say and was storing the rest for later. Christmas came to Red Hollow the way it always did. A little louder than the occasion warranted, with a community St. Bell at the hotel that everyone attended because it was the thing to do, and the winter was long and people needed reasons to be in the same room. Colt went. He had not planned to go with Mara or to make anything obvious of it, but he had told her he would be there, and she had said she was also going, which was not something she usually did with social events. And so when he arrived and found her standing near the far wall with a cup of something warm, talking to Mrs. Haynes, he made his way across the room to where she was. This was noticed immediately by approximately 15 people. They stood together for most of the evening, not touching, not doing anything that could be called demonstrative, just talking the way they always talked, about real things, about what was happening in the county, about the Rourke family whose situation had stabilized, about a problem Colt had been having with the drainage in his south pasture that she had an unexpectedly practical suggestion for based on something she'd seen work on a farm in Ohio. But they were together in the room in a way that was visible, and in Red Hollow, visible was enough. Cecilia Aldridge left the party early. Margaret Aldridge stayed and watched with an expression like someone trying to solve a mathematics problem they were certain had a different answer. Douglas Webb caught Colt's eye across the room at one point and raised his glass just slightly. Acknowledgement, not judgment. Colt appreciated that. And Mara, who was aware of the attention and was not comfortable with it, he could tell that, had come to read her discomfort in the small tension that came into her shoulders. Kept talking, kept engaging, kept her expression neutral and her manner exactly as it always was, which he recognized was its own kind of strength. The ability to hold your ground in a room that was watching you sideways required something that not everyone had. When they stepped outside for a few minutes near the end of the evening, into the cold and the dark, she said quietly, "They're talking." "They were always going to talk," he said. "It might cause you problems." "It already is," he said. "I don't care." She looked at him sideways. "You say that now." "I'll say it in June, too." He looked back at her directly. "I've thought about it, Mara. I'm not going into this without thinking about it." She was quiet for a moment, the cold breath misting in front of her. "I'm not easy to know," she said. It was not an apology or a warning exactly, more like a fact she wanted to make sure he had. "I know," he said. "I'm not either." She almost laughed. A short sound, not quite all the way there, but real. "No," she said. "You're really not." They went back inside. And whatever had been developing between them quietly over the past 2 months became, in that cold, dark doorway, something they'd both decided to acknowledge. The town saw what it wanted to see and drew its conclusions accordingly. The Aldridge women were already revising their strategy. Harlan Cross was storing things up, and Mara Quinn walked back into that room, knowing that something in her life had shifted, though she could not have said yet exactly where it was going to take her or what it was going to cost. She was practical enough to know it would cost something. It always did. But for once, standing next to a man who looked at her the way Colt Mercer looked at her, like she was worth the trouble of actually knowing, she thought maybe it was worth finding out. The party ended around 10. Most people went home. Red Hollow went to sleep under a cold December sky, already arranging itself into camps, already deciding whose side it was on. And in the weeks that followed, the choosing of sides would get very serious indeed. January came in hard that year, the kind of cold that cracked wood and froze the water in the troughs overnight, that made the horses restless and the cattle drift south looking for shelter they weren't going to find. Colt spent the first 2 weeks of the new year doing the grinding maintenance work that winter demanded, checking fencing, moving feed, keeping the operation from losing ground. And he came into town less than usual, which meant the speculation about him and Mara had to survive on what people already had, which turned out to be more than enough. By mid-January, it had become the topic. Not the only topic. There was also the matter of a disputed land survey north of town that had 2 homesteading families barely speaking, and a rumor that the rail company was considering extending its spur further west, which would either save Red Hollow or change it beyond recognition, depending on who you asked. But the question of Colt Mercer and Mara Quinn ran underneath everything else like a low current, surfacing in parlors and at the general store counter and in the back corner of the hotel dining room where men had their Friday drinks. The version of the story that most of the town settled on was simple. Mara had done something to influence him. What exactly? Opinions varied. Some said she'd made herself useful to him, played the practical angle, positioned herself as indispensable. Others went darker, suggesting manipulation of a kind they didn't spell out clearly but implied with meaningful looks. The common thread was that Colt's interest couldn't be genuine, couldn't be the natural outcome of two people actually talking to each other and finding that the talking meant something. That wasn't how the story was supposed to go, and so the town rewrote it into something that made more sense to them. Mara heard the versions. She heard them because, in a town that size, hearing things was unavoidable. Sound traveled through walls. Conversation stopped when she walked into rooms and resumed when she left. And occasionally someone said something directly to her face with a smile that was designed to look like friendliness. The worst of those was Clara Voss, who had been one of the more determined competitors for Colt's attention the previous autumn and who encountered Mara at the general store one afternoon in late January. Clara was with two other women, both of whom arranged themselves slightly behind her in the way that indicated they were there for support rather than active participation. "Mara," Clara said pleasantly, "I keep meaning to bring you that skirt I need taken in. I'll try to get by this week." "Whenever suits you," Mara said. She was looking at the fabric bolts. "It's funny," Clara said, in the tone that meant nothing funny was coming. "How busy you must be these days, with all the extra attention." Mara turned to look at her. "I stay busy." "I'm sure." Clara tilted her head. "I just hope you know what you're doing is all. Men like Colt Mercer, they're kind to people below their station. It's just their nature. It doesn't always mean what a person might hope it means." There was a pause. One of the women behind Clara shifted her weight. Mara looked at Clara for a moment with an expression that was almost entirely neutral. "I appreciate the concern," she said. She picked up a spool of thread and walked to the counter to pay. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. But walking back to her shop that afternoon with the cold wind off the mountains pushing against her, she felt the specific exhaustion of having to hold yourself completely steady in a moment when every part of you wanted to respond differently. She'd gotten good at that over the years. She wasn't sure whether being good at it was something to be proud of or something to be sorry about. When Colt came to see her that Friday, she told him what Clara had said. Not with drama, not looking for comfort. She told him the way she told him most things, straight and plain, because she'd decided early on that if this between them was going to be real, it needed to be built on what was actually happening, not on a managed version of it. He listened. His jaw tightened slightly when she got to the part about being below his station. "Clara Voss," he said. "She wasn't wrong about one thing," Mara said. "People are going to read into this whatever they want to read, and some of it is going to land on you, not just me. I know that. I want to make sure you actually know it, and not just think you know it." He looked at her. "There's a difference? Thinking you know something is easy. Knowing it is when it's actually happening and you still hold to what you said." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "When I was about 22, I made a deal with a buyer out of Cheyenne, sold him a cut of cattle at a price that was fair for both of us, shook hands on it, the whole thing. 2 days later, Harlan Cross came to me and said he wanted that same cattle and he'd pay me 8% more. And all I had to do was tell the Cheyenne buyer there'd been a problem with the herd." Mara waited. "I didn't do it," Colt said. "I lost the 8%. Harlan was annoyed with me for 6 months, but I didn't do it." He met her eyes. "I'm telling you that not to make myself sound like something I'm not. I've made plenty of wrong calls in my life. I'm telling you because keeping your word when it costs you something is the only version of keeping your word that means anything. And I meant what I said to you, Mara. Both times I said it." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right meaning you believe me?" "All right meaning I believe you for now, and I'll keep watching to see if it holds up." She said it dryly, but not without warmth. "That's the best I can offer." "It's enough," he said. It was not a romantic conversation by any conventional standard, but it was honest, and between the two of them, honest was the currency that mattered. What neither of them fully anticipated was how quickly the pressure would escalate beyond social coldness into something with real financial edges. It was Douglas who brought Colt the first sign of it, on a Thursday afternoon in early February, coming out to the ranch specifically rather than waiting for their usual Friday meeting, which told Colt before Douglas opened his mouth that it was something that couldn't wait. They stood in the barn out of the wind while Ike made himself scarce with the particular discretion of an old man who'd learned when not to be present. "Harlan Cross came to see me yesterday," Douglas said. Colt waited. "He represents himself and 3 other outfits: Tulane, the Barrett brothers, and the Western Consolidation Syndicate people. They've been talking." Douglas looked uncomfortable in the way of someone delivering news they'd rather not be delivering. They want to formalize the buying cooperative, create a preferred supplier arrangement with the rail transport company, fixed rates, guaranteed volume. That's been discussed before, Colt said. What's the new part? The new part, Douglas said carefully, is the membership terms. Harlan laid them out pretty clearly. Participating ranches need to meet certain standards, operational standards, financial standards. A pause. And what he called community standing standards. Colt was very still. He said that directly? He said it in the way that lets him say he didn't say it directly, if it ever comes to that. But yes, he said it clearly enough that I understood him. Douglas looked at him steadily. If you continue with Mara Quinn, you won't be included in the cooperative. That's what he was telling me. He wants me to pass it on. The barn was quiet except for the sound of a horse shifting in its stall and the wind working at the gaps in the siding. What does exclusion from the cooperative mean practically? Colt asked, because he wanted to be clear about it rather than assume. It means you lose the preferred transport rate. You go back to negotiating independently, which puts you at about 12% higher cost per head on shipping. It means you lose access to the consolidated buyer network they're building, which means you're selling to whoever you can reach on your own. Over a year, on your volume. Douglas did the arithmetic visibly in his expression. You'd feel it. Probably not catastrophic, but genuinely hard. Colt nodded slowly. And Harlan knows that. Harlan calculated it before he came to see me. That's who he is. There was a long silence. Colt was looking at a fixed point on the barn wall in the way he had when he was thinking through something fully before speaking. What did you say to him? He asked. I said I would pass the information along. I didn't say what you would do with it. That's not my position to take. Douglas paused. Though I'll tell you, Colt, what he's doing here, using a business arrangement to control who a man can spend time with, that's not something I'm comfortable being in the middle of. I'm telling you because you need to know, not because I think you should do what he wants. Colt looked at him. Thank you for that. What are you going to do? Colt was quiet another moment. Then, I'm going to go tell Mara what happened. Douglas blinked. You're going to tell her? She needs to know. It's her situation too. He said it simply, as if this were obvious. And maybe to him it was. Douglas drove back to town with the expression of a man who had come in expecting to deliver difficult news and had instead witnessed something that slightly adjusted his view of the world. He told his wife about it that evening. She said it sounded like Colt Mercer might actually know what he was doing. Douglas said he was starting to think the same thing. Mara's response to being told about the cooperative and Harlan Cross's conditions was not what Colt expected, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected exactly. She sat with it for a moment. They were in her shop, the small back room, the stove going against the February cold. Then she said, How much does the cooperative matter to your operation? It matters. It's not the end if I'm not in it, but it's a real cost. Then you should join it, she said. He looked at her. I mean it. This is your livelihood, Colt. You've built that ranch for 8 years. I'm not going to be the reason you take unnecessary damage to it. You're not the reason. Harlan Cross is the reason. That's a fine distinction that doesn't change the arithmetic. Mara, he leaned forward slightly. If I let Harlan Cross decide who I can spend time with by putting a financial penalty on the alternative, if I accept that, then I don't have any standing to decide anything for myself. Today it's you. Tomorrow it's something else. That's how it works. She looked at him steadily. That's a principled answer. It's also a practical one, he said, because a man who lets that happen once is going to have it happen to him again and again in different forms. Harlan is testing something. I'm telling him the answer. And the 12%? I'll find another way to manage it. She studied him for a long moment. You've actually thought this through. I have. Then why are you telling me? What do you want from me? It was the kind of question only Mara would ask, cutting straight to the actual purpose of a conversation rather than letting it breathe and flow and arrive somewhere organically. He'd gotten used to it, more than used to it. I want you to know, he said. I want you to know what I'm choosing and that I'm choosing it on purpose, because I don't want you to find out later and wonder whether I knew what it cost. She looked at him for a long time. Something moved in her expression that he couldn't fully read. something complicated and not entirely comfortable. The look of someone absorbing the fact that they were being treated with a seriousness they hadn't quite prepared for. "All right," she said. Same word as before, same weight. "Then I'll say this. You turned down the cooperative, and that's your choice, and I respect it. But you let me help where I can, with what I know, with what I see. I know this town better than you think. I've been listening to it for 6 years from a place nobody notices. I know who's in debt to whom, I know whose word is solid and whose isn't. I know which families are struggling and which are pretending not to be. That's not nothing." "I know it's not nothing." "Then use it," she said. "We do this together or we don't do it at all." And that, as much as any moment before it, was when Colt understood what he had in Mara Quinn. Not a woman who needed protecting, not a woman who needed managing or directing or softening reality for. A partner, in the actual sense of that word. Someone who assessed the situation, found her contribution to it, and put it on the table without drama. He had not known how much he'd wanted exactly that until it was sitting across from him in a cold back room above a harness shop on the east end of a small Wyoming town. "Together," he said. She nodded. "Together." The following week, Colt sent word to Douglas to inform Harlan Cross that he would not be joining the cooperative under the stated terms. Douglas delivered the message and reported back that Harlan had received it without visible reaction, which Douglas said was more unsettling than if he'd gotten angry. "Harlan Cross quiet is Harlan Cross planning," Douglas said. "I expect so," Colt said. "You're not worried?" "I'm not worried. I'm just decided." The weeks that followed were not comfortable. The social coldness that had been present before sharpened into something more deliberate. Two families who had used the Mercer outfit as a way station for moving cattle through the territory quietly rerouted. An invitation to a regional ranchers' gathering that Colt would normally have received failed to arrive. Small things, each of them individually deniable, but the pattern was clear enough. Mara felt the equivalent on her end. Work that had been reliably coming her way from certain households dried up without explanation. Mrs. Aldridge, who had brought Mara alterations once a month for 2 years, stopped coming. 2 other women followed. The math of it was modest. Mara's surviving clients more than covered her basic needs. But the intention behind it was not subtle, and the intention was what stung. She didn't tell Colt about the lost work for 2 weeks. When she did, she framed it as information rather than complaint. He was quiet when she told him. Then, "I'll make it up to you." "You won't," she said. "That's not how this works. I'm not keeping a ledger." A pause. "I'm telling you because you said you wanted to know the actual situation." "I did." "Then that's the actual situation. We're both paying for it." She met his eyes. "I'm still not sorry." He wasn't either. That was the thing that surprised him most. All through those uncomfortable weeks, he kept waiting for the doubt to arrive. For some morning when he'd look at the cost of what he was doing and feel the first edge of regret. It didn't come. What came instead, every time he rode into town and walked through her door, and she looked up from whatever she was working on, and there was that not quite a smile at the edge of her expression, was something considerably simpler and more durable. He was in the right place. He was with the right person. The rest of it, Harlan Cross and Margaret Aldridge, and the invitations that didn't arrive and the business that rerouted itself, all of that was noise. Real noise, with real consequences, but noise. Spring was coming. The snow was already pulling back from the lower elevations. In the valley below Red Hollow, the creek was running high with melt, and the whole landscape had that raw, tentative quality of a place working its way back toward life. Whatever was coming next, they would face it in that same raw light. Neither of them knew, in those last mild weeks of early spring, what kind of facing it would actually turn out to require. The spring that year came in like it was trying to make up for the hard winter, warm and fast, with winds off the southern plains that dried the grasses earlier than usual and left the valley floor crackling underfoot by the second week of May. Old-timers in Red Hollow said it was the kind of spring that made you nervous. The kind where the moisture that should have come in March and April just didn't, and everything that grew came up thin and dry. And you looked at the hills and thought about how much of what you were seeing was fuel waiting for a reason. Colt noticed it. Any rancher worth the name noticed it. You watched the grass the way you watched everything that determined whether your year was going to work or not. He'd had Ike move the southern herd further toward the creek beds where the ground stayed damper longer, and he'd been more careful than usual about where they burned off the old growth around the fence lines. These were the small adjustments that experienced men made without drama, the way you adjusted to any condition that wasn't quite right. What nobody adjusted for, because nobody could have predicted the specific combination of factors that produced it, was the fire that started in the dry creek bed north of the Tulane grazing land on the 15th of May. It started sometime in the afternoon. A spark from a freight wagon that had lost a wheel and dragged an iron rim across the rock-studded ground. Or that was the most likely explanation pieced together afterward. By the time anyone saw the smoke, the fire had already taken the dry grass on both sides of the creek bed and was moving southeast on the wind, which was blowing hard out of the northwest that day, which was the worst possible direction given what lay to the southeast. What lay to the southeast was the north end of the valley, the homesteads, the Rourke family on the North Flats. 3 other families in that corridor. And beyond them, if it jumped the road that served as the only real break in the vegetation, the outer edge of Red Hollow itself. The first Mara knew of it was the smell. She was in her shop with the window cracked against the warm afternoon, working on a commission that needed to be done by Friday, when the wind shifted and brought it, not heavy, just the faint char edge underneath the normal air, the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't paying attention. She stopped what she was doing and went to the window. The smoke was visible to the north, not a column, but a spreading haze, the kind of haze that meant it was already wide. She stood there for 3 seconds, calculating. Then she put down the work and went out the door. Main Street was beginning to react. People coming out of buildings, hands shielding eyes against the afternoon glare, looking north. There was that particular quality to the crowd that gathers around a crisis in its first moments. The quality of people who haven't yet decided whether this is serious or whether someone else is going to handle it. Mara did not stop to assess the crowd. She crossed the street to the feed store where Tom Haynes was standing in his doorway. "Tom, how many wagons you have accessible right now?" He blinked at her. 2, maybe 3 if Garrett's still got his Outback. "I need them loaded with water barrels inside 20 minutes. Who's got mules available?" He stared at her for a moment longer than she had time for. "Mara, we should wait and see what those North Flats families have maybe an hour before it reaches them," she said. "We don't have time to wait and see. Do you have the wagons or not?" He did. He started moving. She went to the next person, and the next. She was not commanding in any official sense. She had no authority, no title, no standing in the Red Hollow hierarchy that would have given her the right to tell anyone to do anything. What she had was clarity. While most of the people on that street were still processing what they were looking at, she had already done the calculation. Wind direction, fire spread rate, the distance to the North Flats, what the families there would need to have any chance. It was the same thing she did when she took apart a coat in a back room and laid it on the floor in pieces. She saw the structure of it, understood what was load-bearing and what wasn't, and knew where to start. Mrs. Haynes appeared at her elbow, practical and calm, which was consistent with everything Mara knew about her. "What do you need me to do?" "Get to the families on the North Road. Anyone who can ride, anyone with a horse and cart. Tell them we're moving the homestead families out first, and we need anyone who can carry people or carry supplies." A pause. "The Rourkes have 4 children. They'll need room." Mrs. Haynes was already walking. Douglas Webb found Mara 3 minutes later, grabbed her arm, not roughly, but urgently. "There's an argument happening at the hotel about who's in charge of the response. Harlan Cross is saying they should focus on protecting the south end of town, right off the North Flats." Mara looked at him. "The North Flats is where the Rourkes are, and the Carters, and the Beaumont family." "I know that. If the fire isn't slowed at the North Road break, it doesn't stop at the North Flats. It comes straight down the valley slope into town. Protecting the south end by abandoning the north is not a strategy, it's just panic with a plan attached." She said it quickly, clearly, without heat. "Tell whoever's arguing that. Tell them it's not charitable concern, it's just physics. The fire doesn't care about property values." Douglas almost laughed despite himself. "I'll tell them." She didn't wait to hear how that conversation went. She had 3 wagons being loaded, a rough evacuation order worked out in her head based on which families were furthest from the natural fire breaks and which roads would stay passable longest, and a mental list of what the stranded settlers would need in the next 12 hours, regardless of whether the fire was stopped. What she did not know was where Colt was. He was, as it turned out, already in the fire. He'd seen the smoke from the ridge above his south pasture around the same time Mara smelled it in town, and he'd made the same immediate calculation she had: north flats, families, wind direction. And he'd saddled the fastest horse he had and ridden toward it before the thought was fully formed into words. The Tulane land to the north was already burning when he reached the edge of it, a broad front of low orange moving through the dry grass with the wind behind it. He skirted the edge, choking on the smoke, and pushed northeast to the Rourke homestead because James Rourke had the largest family in the corridor and the smallest margin for delay. He found them loading a wagon in controlled panic, which was better than uncontrolled panic, but not by as much as you'd hope. Eleanor Rourke had the 4 children in various states of readiness. The youngest 2 crying, the oldest, a girl of about 12 named Ada, who had the focused expression of someone determined not to contribute to the problem, carrying a box of supplies out of the house with her jaw set. James Rourke was trying to unhitch the plow horse and switch him to the wagon harness at the same time, which was not going well. Colt was off his horse before it stopped moving. He got to James without preamble. "I'll do the harness. You get the livestock out of the pen. If you leave them, they'll panic and scatter into the fire." James looked at him with the expression of a man who under different circumstances might have had feelings about Colt Mercer showing up on his land, given the general social weather of the past few months. But the fire was 1.5 miles north and moving, and feelings were a thing for a different day. "Southgate on the pen," he said. "It sticks." "I'll manage it," Colt said. He didn't manage it cleanly. The gate stuck as advertised. He had to put his shoulder into it twice before it gave, and by the time the livestock were moving south, he had a bruise forming under his shirt and smoke in his lungs that made the work harder than it should have been. But the Rourke animals were out, and the harness was done. And Eleanor Rourke had the children loaded, all 4 of them, the little one still crying but on the wagon. He pointed James Rourke south on the main road and turned his horse north. The Carter homestead was further into the corridor, closer to where the fire was moving. He reached them to find that Frank Carter had already gone back into his burning outbuilding to retrieve something. He heard Mary Carter screaming her husband's name into the smoke from 20 yards away. Colt tied his horse and went in after him. It was not heroic. It was bad visibility and burning eyes, and Frank Carter crouched over a strongbox in the back corner of a building that had about 4 minutes of structural integrity left, trying to work a latch that the heat had warped shut. "Leave it," Colt said. "It's everything," Frank said. He didn't mean the money, or not only the money. He meant the deed, the land papers, the documentation of everything he'd built and claimed and fought to keep. Colt understood that. He also understood the ceiling above them. "Where's the edge of it?" Frank pointed. Colt got his hands under the box. It was heavier than it looked, iron-cornered, and between them they got it moving. They got it to the door. They got it out. They were 10 yards from the building when the roof came in. Frank Carter sat down hard on the ground outside with the strongbox between his feet and just breathed for a full minute. Colt crouched next to him, doing the same. His eyes were streaming and his throat felt scraped. "Why'd you come back for me?" Frank said finally. His voice was rough. "Because you were in there," Colt said. Frank looked at him. This was a man who had been, if not part of the social campaign against Colt and Mara, at least not notably outside it. The kind of person who goes along with the current in a small town because going against the current takes energy that life doesn't always leave you. "My wife's out front," Frank said. "I know. Get to her." By the time Colt had the Carter family moving south, 2 hours had passed since he'd left the ranch, and the fire line had moved further than he'd expected. The wind had shifted slightly, pushing the burn southeast more aggressively. He could see from the rise above the Carter place that the North Road break, the unpaved track that was the main natural barrier between the flats and the town, was going to be tested sooner than anyone had planned for. He rode south hard, pulling out of the smoke into clearer air, and nearly collided with the first of Mara's wagons coming north on the road. The driver was Tom Haynes, with 2 other men in the bed and a load of water barrels in the back. Behind him, another wagon, and another. Colt pulled alongside. 3 families out from the north corridor. The Rourkes and Carters are on the road south. I don't know about the Beaumonts. "Beaumonts got themselves out an hour ago," Tom said. "Came through town with everything they could carry. Mrs. Quinn sent us up. said the real problem now is the road break. If the fire jumps it, it's going to try, Colt said. That northwest wind is pushing it straight at the crossing point. Tom nodded grimly. She said to wet the brake. Said if we can get enough water on the vegetation along the road for 200 yards on each side of the crossing, the fire might not take. She worked it out on paper. She has a... He stopped, seemed briefly uncertain how to characterize what she had. She's got a whole thing worked out. Back at the feed store, she sent runners to the creek to divert water toward the low point at the crossing. Colt stared at him. She's diverting creek water? She remembered there's a natural channel that runs toward that low point. Something to do with the grade of the land. She said it wouldn't stop the fire, but it might slow it enough. A pause. She seemed pretty sure about it. He left Tom in the wagons and rode back toward town faster than was entirely sensible. He came into Red Hollow from the North Road to find the main street transformed. People moving with purpose rather than milling. Several organized groups clearly operating on some kind of coordination. He found Mara at the feed store, which had become the operational center of the response by virtue of having space and being where she'd started. She was standing at a rough map she'd drawn on a piece of board. The valley, the road, the creek, the fire line as best she could estimate it from what runners had brought back. There were 4 people around her, listening. She was talking quickly, pointing. She registered him coming through the door without breaking the conversation, which was very Mara. She held up one finger, 1 minute, and finished what she was saying to the group, who dispersed toward specific tasks. Then she looked at him. Her face was tired and streaked with dust, and there was a tension in her jaw that he hadn't seen before. "Carter family?" she said. "Out. All 3 families from the North Corridor are on the road." She exhaled, not dramatically, just a single breath of something releasing. "The road break is the problem now. Tom told me. The creek diversion. The grade runs toward that low crossing. I've walked that road enough to know it. If we can get standing water along the road break on both sides of the crossing, the fire hits wet ground and loses momentum. It won't stop it entirely, but it gives us a chance." She looked at him directly. "I need you on the south side of the crossing with the wagons, keeping the wet line maintained. The creek diversion should start flowing that way in the next half hour if James Rourke's oldest son did what I sent him to do." "You sent Ada Rourke to divert a creek?" "She's 12, not 6. She knows that land better than any adult in this town, and she was the only person available who could find the channel inlet. I sent 2 men with her." A pause. "She wanted to do it." He looked at her for a moment. There was no version of this situation in which he had the standing to second-guess her. She had seen the whole of it, organized the response, and was 2 steps ahead of everyone, including him. "I'll be at the crossing," he said. "Take 2 of Tom's wagons with you, and Colt." She stopped him as he turned. "Be careful." It was the first time she'd said anything like that to him, direct and unadorned, without the careful distance she usually maintained. "Always am," he said. She gave him the look that meant she knew that was not entirely true. The next 4 hours were the kind that leave marks on a person. Not the dramatic visible marks, necessarily, but the kind that change something in the way you see the world afterward. Colt worked the road break with Tom Haynes and 6 other men, running wet loads from the creek diversion that had, Ada Rourke having done exactly what she was sent to do, started flowing into the low point at the crossing. They soaked the vegetation on both sides of the road in a 200-yard corridor, and when the fire front reached the crossing point an hour before sunset, it hit wet ground and faltered. It didn't stop immediately. It pushed along the edges, looking for a dry path, found one on the east side, and started to creep through. 2 of Tom's men caught it with water barrels before it established itself. The wind died slightly around 6 in the evening, which nobody had planned for or predicted, and the combination of the wet break and the reduced wind was enough. The fire burned itself against the road. Not cleanly. It scorched 50 yards of fencing on the east side and took a small outbuilding that belonged to a man named Pruitt who had been using it for storage, but it did not cross into Red Hollow proper. The north flats were burned. The Rourke homestead was gone. The Carter outbuilding was gone. 3 other structures on the corridor were damaged or destroyed, but no one died. No one was badly hurt, and the town itself was standing. When Colt rode back into Red Hollow as the light was failing and the smoke was thinning to a gray haze over the valley, He found people gathered in the main street in the particular exhausted quiet that follows something serious. Some of them looked at him. Some of them looked north, at what they could see of the burn line against the darkening sky. He found Mara at the edge of the crowd, standing with Mrs. Haynes, both of them covered in dust and smoke smell. She looked more tired than he had seen her look before, the kind of tired that goes into the bone. He didn't say anything for a moment. He stood next to her and looked at the same thing she was looking at. "The Rourkes," she said quietly. "They don't have a home to go back to." "No," he said. "We'll need to figure out where they stay. And the winter stores they had? Those are gone too." She was already moving to the next problem, the way she always did. But her voice had a flat quality to it that he recognized as the sound of someone running on the last of what they had. "Mara." He said her name, not loudly, just enough. She stopped. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll figure it out tomorrow. Tonight you should stop." She looked at him. For once, she didn't push back or reframe it as information or redirect to the next task. She just looked at him, and something in her expression, not weakness, not collapse, just the visible weight of someone who had been carrying a great deal for a very long time, made him want to put a hand on her shoulder, which he did, briefly and without making much of it. She didn't move away from it. Around them, Red Hollow breathed in the aftermath of the worst day it had seen in years. The night was coming in cool off the mountains. The burn smell hung over everything. And the people who had spent months deciding that Mara Quinn was someone to mock and dismiss stood in the same smoke and dust she stood in, some of them only just beginning to understand what had happened and what it had cost her and what, without her, it might have cost them. The morning after the fire, Red Hollow looked like a town that had survived something it hadn't fully expected to survive. The smoke smell was still in everything, in the clothes people put on, in the curtains, in the grain at the feed store. A thin haze sat over the north end of the valley, where the burn had exhausted itself against the wet road break, and if you stood on the high end of Main Street and looked north, you could see the black line of scorched grass running across the flats like a scar drawn with a wide brush. People moved through the morning slowly, not lazily. There was too much to do for that, but with the careful, deliberate quality of people who had used everything they had the day before and were now operating on whatever was left. Tom Haynes opened the feed store early. Douglas Webb was at his office before 7, which was unusual for him. Mrs. Haynes had a pot of something going at her kitchen table for anyone who came by, and several people did. The first real gathering of consequence happened late morning at the hotel, where about 30 of the town's residents collected without formal announcement. The way people collect after shared crises, half to process what happened, half to figure out what came next. Colt was there. Mara almost wasn't. She had come into town that morning to check on the families who'd been displaced. The Rourkes were staying with the Haynes household, which was generous and cramped in roughly equal measure. The Carters had gone to Eleanor Rourke's sister on the south end of town, and she'd stopped at the feed store to talk to Tom about the supply situation for the coming weeks. She was not planning to go to the hotel gathering. She had not been in the habit of attending gatherings where her presence would be noticed and assessed, and old habits are persistent things. It was Ada Rourke who changed that. The girl came running down the main street with her long stride and found Mara outside the feed store and said breathless that her father wanted to speak at the meeting and he wanted Mara there when he did. Mara looked at her. "What does your father want to say?" "I don't know exactly, but he said it matters that you're there when he says it." The girl paused. "Please, Miss Quinn." Mara went. The hotel dining room held about 30 people comfortably and was attempting to hold more than that. Colt was near the back wall, standing rather than sitting because most of the chairs were taken, and he found her when she came in and his expression said he hadn't been sure she'd come. She gave him the smallest shrug. Here, the conversation at the front of the room had the disorganized quality of things that didn't have a clear leader. 3 or 4 men talking over each other about the burn damage, the displaced families, the question of who was responsible for the loss of the Prewitt outbuilding, which Prewitt himself seemed inclined to make more of a legal issue than anyone thought was warranted given the circumstances. Harlan Cross was there, standing near the front, saying very little but positioned in a way that made it clear he considered himself central to whatever was going to happen. James Rourke stood up somewhere in the middle of it. He was not a tall man, and he was not a natural speaker. He had the hands of someone who worked land for a living and the face of someone who had been doing it for longer than was entirely comfortable. And when he stood up, it took a moment for the room to notice and quiet enough to hear him. "I want to say something," he said, "about yesterday." The room settled. "My family is alive," James said. He said it plainly, without embellishment, the way a man states a fact he's still getting used to. "My children are alive. We lost the house. We lost the stores. But we are alive. And I want to say in front of everyone here why that is." He looked across the room to where Mara was standing near the door. "Colt Mercer came to my homestead and got my animals out, and got my family moving when I was still trying to figure out what to do first," he said. "And Mara Quinn had wagons on the North Road with water before most of this town had decided the fire was serious." He paused. "She organized the evacuation. She figured out the creek diversion that held the fire at the road break. She sent my daughter Ada to find the channel inlet, and my daughter did it." Another pause. "And this one had weight in it. I've lived in this valley 6 years, and I've watched how some of you treat that woman. I've been guilty of it myself, by silence, if not by action. I'm standing here now because of her, and I won't pretend otherwise." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when something true has been said out loud that most people had been managing to avoid. Harlan Cross's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. James Rourke sat down. His wife Eleanor, next to him, put her hand briefly on his arm without looking at him. It was not the last thing said that morning, but it was the thing that changed the register of everything said after it. The conversation that followed was different, more direct, less managed, less concerned with the usual social ordering of who got to speak and who deferred. Tom Haynes backed James up without prompting, said the wagons had been Mara's idea, and the map had been Mara's, and the timing had been Mara's. "Mrs." Haynes said more quietly that this was not a surprise to anyone who had paid attention over the past 6 years, which produced a particular silence in the women's portion of the room. Margaret Aldridge was there. She said nothing during that meeting, but she listened, which was more than some people managed. Colt did not speak during the meeting either. He had decided before it started that this was not his moment to speak, that anything he said about Mara would be filed under personal interest by most of the room, and that the accounting needed to come from other people to mean what it should mean. He stood at the back wall and watched and let it happen. Afterward, in the corridor outside the dining room, Harlan Cross found him. This surprised Colt slightly. Harlan had not sought him out directly since the cooperative conversation in February, had conducted whatever was between them through the medium of things that didn't happen, invitations that didn't arrive, business that rerouted. The directness of it now said something. Harlan looked older in daylight than he usually did. The fire and the response to it had required him to be present for something that did not organize itself according to his priorities, and it showed on him in a specific way. "Your girl held the line at the road break," Harlan said. He said it without a qualifying clause, without a but attached to the end of it, which Colt noted. "She did," Colt said. A pause. Harlan looked down the corridor. The diversion idea. Where did she get that? "She walked the road. She paid attention to the land." Colt looked at him steadily. "That's the whole of it." Another pause. "I'm going to say something to you that I won't necessarily repeat in a large room," Harlan said. His voice had dropped to the register men used when they were being honest rather than performing. "I've been wrong in how I read that woman. The practical intelligence she's got. I didn't account for it." He seemed to find the admission genuinely uncomfortable, which Colt thought was at least honest. "I'm not saying everything changes. I'm not made of the material that changes quickly. Such what?" "I know you're not," Colt said, "but I'm telling you I know I was wrong. And the cooperatives, the terms I put to Douglas in February." He stopped. "Those terms won't be repeated." Colt held his gaze for a moment. There was a version of this conversation where he extracted more, an explicit apology, a reversal stated in precise terms, a public acknowledgement. Harlan Cross was not built for that, and both of them knew it. What he was offering was what he was capable of offering, and it was more than Colt had expected to get. "I'll tell Douglas," Colt said. "Thank you for saying it." Harlan nodded once and walked away, which was all the grace either of them was going to manage. Colt found Mara outside, on the hotel's front step, where she'd retreated from the room as soon as the formal part of the meeting wound down. She was sitting on the step with her elbows on her knees, looking at the main street, which had the quiet of a place still recovering its normal rhythm. He sat down next to her. "James Rourke," she said after a moment. "He meant it," Colt said. "I know he did. That's what made it—" She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "It was a harder thing to hear than I expected. The gracious version is harder than the other version. I've had years of practice with the other version." He understood that. "Harlan Cross spoke to me," he said. She looked at him. He told her what Harlan had said, accurately and without commentary. She listened to all of it. "He said the cooperative terms won't be repeated," she said when he finished. "Yes." She thought about that. "That's more than I expected from him." "Me too." She looked back at the street. A family was passing with a loaded cart, supplies for someone, or someone's belongings being moved. The ordinary traffic of aftermath. "What do we do with it?" she said. "With what?" "With all of it. The shift." She gestured vaguely, which was uncharacteristic of her. "I don't quite know how to be with it. I know how to be in a room where people have decided what I am. I've been doing that for years. I don't know as well how to be in a room where people are revising it." He considered that. "You just be what you are. Same as always. They're the ones revising, not you." She looked at him sideways. "That's easy to say." "It is," he agreed. "It's also true." A pause. "Clara Voss came to find me this morning," Mara said. Her voice was careful. "She was the first one, before the meeting. She came to the feed store and she stood there and she said she owed me an apology for the things she said in January." Mara was quiet for a moment. She didn't say it gracefully. She was uncomfortable the whole time, but she said it. "What did you say?" "I said I appreciated her coming." Mara paused. "It was all I had. I don't quite know how to accept an apology from someone I know would not be offering it if the fire hadn't happened." "Maybe she would have gotten there eventually," Colt said. "Maybe." She didn't sound convinced. "It doesn't feel the same as if she'd come to me in February and said it then." "No," he said. "It's not the same, but it's still something." She accepted that with the particular expression she had when she was filing something away to think about more later. The work that followed over the next several days was concrete and exhausting, and left less room for the complicated emotional accounting that the day after the fire had opened up. There were families who needed immediate shelter assistance, supplies that needed to be organized and distributed, a question of temporary structures for the Rourkes that needed to be resolved before the late spring weather turned unpredictable again. Colt put the Mercer Ranch's resources toward it without making an announcement about doing so. He sent lumber, he sent Ike with 2 other hands to help with the labor. He quietly settled the question of where the Rourke family would stay for the next 2 months by offering 2 unused rooms at the ranch itself, which James Rourke accepted after a day of deliberation with the expression of a man who was setting down a pride that had become too heavy to carry in the current circumstances. Mara organized the supply distribution the same way she'd organized the evacuation, practically without drama, using the same knowledge of who needed what and who had what to give that she'd been accumulating invisibly for 6 years. Mrs. Haynes worked alongside her. Tom Haynes's wife, who had not previously been part of Mara's social world in any meaningful way, appeared on the second day and asked what she could do, and Mara told her. And she did it. It was not a transformation. It was not the whole town turning in unison to embrace the woman it had marginalized. The frontier didn't work that way, and people didn't work that way. There were still households that had nothing to say to Mara Quinn and still considered her outside their circle. Margaret Aldridge remained correct and distant rather than warm. Several of the women who had followed Clara Voss's lead in January managed their apologies mostly by acting as if January hadn't happened, which was a form of apology that satisfied nobody but was apparently the best they could manage. But the texture of things had changed. The room that Mara entered was different from the room she'd been entering for 6 years, and the difference was not subtle. People made space. People acknowledged her when they passed. The specific public dismissal, the eyes that slid past her, the conversations that didn't include her, had stopped, or mostly stopped, in the way that things stop when they've become too obviously wrong for the people doing them to maintain comfortably. Colt watched it and felt something he didn't have a ready word for. Relief was part of it, but relief implied he'd been worried it wouldn't happen, and he had believed, even in the worst of the winter months, that Mara's quality would eventually be visible to people who had the eyes to see it. He just hadn't known what form the scene would take. What he hadn't anticipated was the specific way it affected her. He'd expected her to receive the shift with the same level practicality she brought to most things, file it away, move forward. What he saw instead was something more complicated and more human than that. A wariness that sat alongside the adjustment, a careful hesitation in how she moved through the changed room, as if she was not quite sure the ground was solid yet, and was testing each step before she put her weight on it. He understood that. 6 years of being read a certain way leaves its marks. You don't simply accept the revised reading because the people doing the reading have decided to revise it. You wait to see if it holds. He told her this one evening, about a week after the fire, sitting on the step outside her shop after she'd closed for the day. The light was going long and golden the way it did in late May, everything amber and quiet. "You're waiting for it to go back," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "The way people are treating you now. You're not quite trusting it. You're waiting for it to revert." A pause. She didn't deny it. "Is it that visible?" "Only to me, because I've been watching you long enough to know what your different kinds of quiet look like." She considered that for a moment. The light on the street, a horse going by at a walk. "It's not rational," she said. "I know what happened. The fire happened, and it showed people something they'd chosen not to see. That's real. I know that's real. But the reason it changed is still external. I didn't change. They changed because circumstances forced it. And I don't know how permanent a change is that came from being forced." He sat with that for a moment. "No," he said. "You don't know. You might not know for a long time." He looked at her. "But you're going to have to let it be uncertain. You can't hold yourself back from the new version because the old version might come back. That's not a way to live." She looked at him with the expression that meant she was deciding whether to agree or push back. It resolved, after a moment, into something else. Not quite agreement, not quite surrender, but the acknowledgement of someone accepting that a thing has been said accurately. "When did you get wise?" she said, a faint dryness in it. "I've always been wise," he said. "You just argued with me too much to notice." She almost laughed. The real one. The one that was rare and therefore worth more. It didn't quite make it all the way out, but it was close. "I'm going to marry you," he said. He said it the same way he said most things to her, plain, no performance, just a fact he was placing on the table between them. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Is that agreement or resignation?" "It's a statement of awareness," she said. "Ask me properly, and I'll give you a proper answer." "All right." He turned toward her on the step, which was slightly awkward given the geometry of it, and looked at her directly. "Mara Quinn, will you marry me?" She held his gaze for a moment. The evening light, the smoke smell that still sat in the air over the valley, fainter every day. "Yes," she said, simply and without decoration, which was exactly how it should have been said. They sat on that step for another half hour in the quiet, not talking about much, the kind of quiet that settles between people who don't need to fill it. Around them, Red Hollow moved through its evening. Lights coming on in windows, the smell of supper, a dog barking somewhere on the south end of town. It was not a triumphant moment. It was just the ordinary texture of an evening in a small frontier town, which happened also to be the evening that contained this thing between them, settled and confirmed and real. They set the wedding for the second Saturday in August, which gave them about 2.5 months, long enough to let the valley finish its recovery from the fire, short enough that it didn't feel like they were waiting for permission from anyone. Mara did not want a large wedding. She said this to Colt clearly in the first conversation they had about it, sitting at the small table in her back room with a cup of coffee going cold between them, because neither of them was the kind of person who remembered to drink something while they were talking about something else. "Small," she said. "The people who matter, not a performance." "All right," he said. "I mean it, Colt. I don't want a wedding that's really about proving something to this town. If people want to witness it, fine. But that's not what it's for." He looked at her across the table. "What is it for?" She thought about it with the directness she brought to everything. "It's for us," she said. "Just us. The rest of it is secondary. Then we do it that way, he said. What actually happened, as these things tend to, was something between what she wanted and what a frontier community does with any significant occasion, whether invited to or not. Word traveled, as word always traveled, in Red Hollow, and by the time August arrived, the number of people who planned to attend had grown well beyond what Mara had originally imagined, and she made a kind of peace with that by deciding that it was not her job to manage what the town chose to do with its Saturday afternoon. The ceremony itself was held outdoors, on the flat ground between the hotel and the feed store, because no indoor space in Red Hollow was large enough for what it became. The Justice of the Peace, a man named Albert Cray, who had performed perhaps a dozen such ceremonies in his time, and had never quite managed to make any of them sound spontaneous, read the words. Colt and Mara said what needed to be said. It was not particularly eloquent. Colt stumbled slightly over one of the responses, which Mara noticed and which produced in her exactly the small private reaction, a softening at the corner of her mouth, that told him everything was all right. Douglas Webb was there with his wife and 3 children. Mrs. Haynes was there. Tom Haynes. The Rourke family, all 6 of them. James standing straight in clothes that were not his best, but were clearly his best available. Eleanor with the 2 youngest in front of her. Ada at the end of the family row, with the particular expression of a 12-year-old who has decided to take an occasion seriously. Frank Carter was there. He stood near the back and he took his hat off when the ceremony started, which was the kind of small gesture that cost a person nothing and meant more than it should. Even Margaret Aldridge came. She stood near the side, correct as always in her posture and her dress, and she watched with an expression that had moved some distance from where it had been in December. Not warmth, not anything approaching friendship, but the acknowledgement of someone accepting a reality they had resisted and finding it was not, in the end, the catastrophe they'd feared. Cecilia Aldridge was not there. That was fine. Nobody expected everything. Harlan Cross did not attend the ceremony, but he sent a note that arrived at the Mercer Ranch the morning of the wedding, addressed to both of them, which was a detail that Colt noted. It said, in Harlan's characteristically compressed style, that he wished them well, and that the cooperative's terms were formally amended to include the Mercer operation under standard membership conditions. No apology, no acknowledgement of the months of pressure. Just the practical statement, the open door, and the 2 names on the envelope. It was the most that Harlan Cross was built to give, and Colt read it twice and put it in the drawer where he kept things that mattered and didn't need to be displayed. He showed it to Mara before they left for the ceremony. She read it, folded it, handed it back. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. That was all either of them needed to say about it. The gathering after the ceremony had the particular quality of frontier celebrations. Too much food, not enough chairs, people standing in clusters across the flat ground with plates balanced on their forearms, conversations running in every direction. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a second instrument that Colt couldn't identify from across the crowd. And there was music for about an hour that nobody had planned but that seemed to arrive naturally, the way things sometimes do when enough people are in the same place and the occasion is right. Mara moved through it with the careful steadiness she'd been practicing since the week after the fire. She was not comfortable in large social situations in the way that some people are naturally comfortable. She did not expand into a room, did not project warmth at a distance, did not manage the surface of things with the practiced ease that frontier women who had grown up in this world had usually acquired. What she did was engage directly with whoever was in front of her, ask them something real, listen to the answer, and move to the next conversation without performing the transition. It was not the social manner Red Hollow was accustomed to, but it was honest, and people felt the difference even when they couldn't have said what it was. Ada Rourke found her near the end of the afternoon and stood next to her for a moment without saying anything, which was fine because Mara was also not saying anything, both of them watching the crowd from the same angle. "My father said you saved us," Ada said finally. "Your father and Colt got your family out," Mara said. "He said you had the wagons on the road, and the creek thing." "I figured something out," Mara said. "You actually went and did it. That's different." Ada considered that. She was the kind of 12-year-old who considered things rather than just moving past them. "I wasn't scared," she said. And then after a pause, "That's not true. I was scared, but I went anyway." Mara looked at her. That's what brave actually is, she said. The other version, not being scared. That's just not understanding the situation. Ada looked back at her with the expression of someone filing something away. Can I come see you sometime? At your shop? Mara looked at her for a moment. You want to learn to sew? I want to learn how you think, Ada said. Simply, and without self-consciousness, the way children sometimes say the most accurate things, because they haven't yet learned to dress them up into something more socially acceptable. Mara was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her expression that she didn't try to manage. Yes, she said, come by whenever you like. The Rourke homestead was rebuilt over the summer, not by any single grand effort, but by the accumulated work of several weeks, different people contributing different things on different days, the way frontier communities had always done it when they did it right. Colt sent lumber and hands. Tom Haynes organized the roof work. 3 other families provided labor on different weekends. It was not fast and it was not perfect. The new structure was simpler than the original, with less finished interior work and 1 fewer room, but it was solid and it was standing before September, which was what mattered. James Rourke came to Colt on the Saturday the last of the work was finished, when the 2 of them were standing outside what was now recognizably a house again. It was a clear afternoon, the mountains visible to the west with the early suggestion of snow on the highest peaks. The valley grass gone gold and dry again, but in the ordinary way of late summer rather than the dangerous way of May. I want to say something to you, James said. He had the same manner he'd had at the hotel meeting, plain, uncomfortable with the saying of it, but determined to say it anyway. About how I've been, with you and Mara. James, let me say it. A pause. I knew what people were doing. In the winter. The way they talked about her, the way they treated her. I didn't participate directly, but I didn't say anything either. I told myself it wasn't my business. He looked at the new house in front of them. She organized the rescue of my family. She sent my daughter into that field to find the water channel. She did that for people who had given her nothing. And I knew, even while I was keeping quiet about it, that she was worth more than what this town gave her. Colt didn't say anything. I'm not asking you to tell me it's fine, James said. I know it's not entirely fine. I just wanted you to know I know it. Colt looked at him. Tell her, he said. Not me. James nodded. He did tell her the following week when Mara came out to see the finished house. He said it in the same plain way he'd said it to Colt, standing in the doorway of the new structure with his hands in his pockets and his eyes not quite meeting hers. It was awkward in the specific way that honest apologies usually are, which is to say it was uncomfortable for everyone involved and completely necessary anyway. Mara listened to all of it. Then she said, I know you kept quiet. I know why. I'm not going to tell you it didn't sting, because it did. A pause. But I also know you're the one who stood up in that hotel room and said what you said. You didn't have to do that. You did it anyway. It was the least I could do, James said. It was more than a lot of people did, she said. So we're square, James. We're square. It was not a perfect resolution. Real resolutions between people rarely are. There was still history between Mara and the broader social world of Red Hollow that didn't dissolve because a crisis had forced a reassessment. There were still households that operated on the old understanding, still women who looked past her in a way they'd been looking past her since she arrived, still the low hum of her position as an outsider that 6 years of accumulated history didn't simply erase because 6 months of changed circumstances had arrived. But here is what is true about the way perception shifts in small communities, and what was true in Red Hollow from that summer forward. Once a person has been seen doing something real, something that cannot be argued away or reframed into manipulation or luck, the old story becomes harder to tell. Not impossible. People are capable of remarkable feats of selective memory when the alternative is acknowledging they were wrong. But harder. The story has a competing version now, and the competing version is the one that held up when the fire came. Mara Quinn held up when the fire came. Red Hollow saw it. And what a community sees, it cannot entirely unsee. She moved into the Mercer Ranch in September, which required a practical reorganization of 2 people's lives that was more complicated and less romantic than the idea of it. Her rooms above the harness shop had to be cleared. 6 years of accumulated life, the tools of her trade, the things her mother had left her that she'd been carrying since Ohio. She kept the sewing work. set up a proper space for it in a room at the ranch that had good light, and kept one day a week in town for clients who couldn't come out to her. It was a different arrangement, not a perfect one. She and Colt had to learn each other in the close quarters of shared daily life, which turned out to involve some friction that the careful distance of courtship had not predicted. She was more private than he'd expected, in the way of people who have been alone a long time and built their interior life in solitude. She needed quiet in the mornings. She had opinions about how things should be organized that were different from the way he'd been organizing them for 8 years, and she stated those opinions directly, which was consistent with everything he knew about her, but still sometimes landed harder than either of them intended. He was less patient than she'd expected, not with her specifically, but with the operational frustrations of ranch life. Equipment that failed, labor that was unreliable, weather that made plans irrelevant. And when he was frustrated, he went quiet in a way that she initially read as something directed at her and had to learn was just him processing. That misreading caused 2 real arguments in the first 2 months, both of which ended in the particular exhausted honesty of people who are committed to working through things rather than winning them. They were not a perfect match in the way that stories sometimes present people as perfectly matched. They were 2 people with established habits and particular edges, learning to occupy the same space without losing what they each were. It was slower than easy and better than comfortable, which is probably the best you can say for any marriage that's actually working. Ike Dutton watched all of this with the expression of a man who had seen several cycles of the world and was not particularly surprised by any of it. He approved of Mara, which he demonstrated by listening when she talked about the ranch operations and occasionally, very occasionally, saying that she had a point about something, which, from Ike, was approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. The cooperative question resolved itself the way Harlan Cross had indicated it would. The Mercer operation was included in the preferred supplier arrangement on standard terms. Colt did not make much of this. Neither did Mara. It was a practical matter, and they treated it practically, which was probably the right response, though Douglas Webb, when he heard about it, allowed himself a small private satisfaction on their behalf. The autumn was good. The ranch's cattle operation had a stronger than expected yield for the season. 2 of the families on the North Flats, rebuilt and restocked from community assistance, came through their first post-fire harvest in reasonable shape. The Rourkes were still in their new house when the first heavy frost came in October, and James Rourke's oldest son had taken on part-time work at the Mercer Ranch that was going well enough to suggest it might become permanent. Ada Rourke came to the ranch on several Saturdays, as she'd said she wanted to. She did not turn out to be particularly interested in sewing in the technical sense. Her hands were impatient with the precision of it. But she was intensely interested in watching Mara think, in how she took apart a problem, laid out its pieces, found the structure underneath. She asked questions that were sometimes startlingly direct and always genuine, and Mara answered them the same way without simplifying. And the 2 of them developed an understanding that was not quite teacher and student, and not quite anything else in the existing categories either. One Saturday in late October, Ada asked Mara something that she'd been working up to for several weeks, going by how she said it, with the specific careful quality of someone who has rehearsed the approach. "Were you always sure?" Ada asked. "About Mr. Mercer? About choosing this?" She gestured vaguely at the ranch, the situation, the life. Mara thought about the question seriously, the way Ada had come to expect her to. "No," she said. "I was never fully sure. I knew what I was risking, and I went ahead anyway because I thought it was worth the risk." "How did you know it was worth it?" "I didn't know," Mara said. "Not the way you know 2 + 2 is 4. I made a judgment. There's a difference." She looked at the girl. "Most of the important decisions you'll ever make in your life won't come with certainty attached. You make the best judgment you can with what you know, and then you hold to it when it gets hard, and you find out eventually if you were right. What if you're wrong? Then you deal with being wrong, and you make another judgment." A pause. "Being willing to be wrong is part of it. You can't make real decisions if you can only afford to be right." Ada sat with that for a while. Then, "My father said people here were unkind to you." "Some were," Mara said evenly. "Did you want to leave?" It was the most personal question Ada had asked, and she seemed to know it. She watched Mara's face carefully when she asked it. Mara considered it honestly. "Sometimes," she said. "In the hard months of last winter, yes. I thought about whether staying was just stubbornness wearing the mask of resilience. A pause. But I'd built something here, small as it was. My work, my routines, a few people who were decent to me. I wasn't willing to let other people's opinion of me be the reason I left something I'd built. That's brave, Ada said. Or stubborn, Mara said. I told you. They look alike sometimes. Here is what the town of Red Hollow looked like 3 years after the fire, for anyone keeping account of such things. It was not transformed. Transformations of the dramatic kind are mostly stories people tell afterward to make sense of change that was actually slower and messier and more partial than the story allows. What Red Hollow was, 3 years on, was a place where Mara Mercer, she had taken the name quietly and without announcement, and it had settled into use the way names do, was known, genuinely known, in the way she had not been known before. Not universally liked, not everyone's first choice for company at a social gathering, but known, seen, consulted when there was a problem that needed someone who could see its structure clearly. Acknowledged when she entered a room by people who had once looked past her as if she were furniture. It was not vindication in the way stories like to present vindication, the full reversal, the public triumph, the crowd that once jeered now cheering. That is a satisfying shape, but it is rarely the true one. What was true was smaller and more durable. The specific change in how a specific community related to a specific woman built incrementally over 3 years of her simply being exactly what she had always been, in a place where people finally had the context to see it. Colt knew this. He watched it, and he thought, on the evenings when the ranch was quiet and the two of them were sitting on the front step the way they'd taken to doing when the weather allowed, that the people who had called his choice foolish had been wrong about the nature of the choice. They thought he had chosen a woman in spite of what she lacked. He had chosen her because of what she had. And what she had was the kind of thing that takes time to be visible in conditions of ordinary comfort. It takes pressure to show. It takes the hard winter and the fire in the room that isn't with you to reveal what a person is actually made of. He had seen it from the beginning. Or not the beginning. He had been paying close enough attention early enough to see it before the crisis made it undeniable for everyone else. That was all. It was not wisdom or special perception. It was just the result of actually looking at a person, rather than looking at the idea of them. One evening in November of that 3rd year, they were sitting on that front step in the last of the autumn light, the mountains going dark to the west, the valley below already in shadow. Mara had a piece of mending in her hands that she was not actually working on. She was holding it the way people hold things when they want something to do with their hands while they're thinking. I got a letter from a woman in Casper, she said. She's setting up a household goods cooperative for frontier women. Organized supply purchasing, shared resources. She asked if I wanted to be involved in the planning. Colt looked at her. How'd she hear about you? Mrs. Haynes apparently wrote to someone who wrote to someone. She paused. It would take time. Letters back and forth. Maybe a trip to Casper eventually. Do you want to do it? She thought about it. Yes, she said. I think I do. Then do it, he said. She looked at him sideways. You don't want to know more about it first? You've already thought through whether it's a good idea, he said. I can see it in how you asked the question. If you thought it was a bad idea, you wouldn't have mentioned it yet. She looked at him for a moment. You know me too well. Getting there, he said. She went back to looking at the valley. The light was almost gone now. Somewhere below, a coyote was working its way along the creek bed, audible but not visible, the sound of something going about its business in the dark. Colt, she said. That first day you stayed to talk, in the shop, when you asked me what I thought about when I was working. She paused. I knew then. Knew what? That you were different. She said it without looking at him. Most people don't ask that question because most people don't actually want to know the answer. They want the surface of a person. You wanted to know what was underneath. He was quiet for a moment. What did you think about it when you figured that out? I thought it was going to be complicated, she said. Was I wrong? No, she said. You were exactly right. It was complicated. She almost smiled. He could see the edge of it from where he sat. Worth it, he said. She considered the question with the same honest weight she brought to every question he'd ever asked her. The ranch around them. The burned-over valley that had grown back thinner but still green. The town below that had revised its understanding of who she was, imperfectly and slowly and under duress, but revised it nonetheless. The life she had built, strange and different from anything she'd planned, in a place she'd nearly left and hadn't. Yes, she said, worth it, and that was enough. Not everything. Life doesn't give you everything, and this one didn't either. There would be more hard winters and more problems that didn't resolve cleanly and more rooms where Mara Mercer had to hold herself steady under the weight of being assessed. There would be arguments at the ranch and equipment failures and seasons that didn't go the way they needed to. Harlan Cross would remain difficult until he died, which he did, of natural causes, 4 years later, having never quite expanded beyond what he was. Ada Rourke would grow up to be someone considerable. That was already apparent, though the particular shape of it was still forming. None of it would be simple. None of it would be the version of the story where everything becomes easy because the hard part is over. But here's what is true, and what the story of Red Hollow and Mara Quinn and a rancher who paid actual attention teaches, if it teaches anything. The world tends to see what it has already decided to see. It takes effort to look at a person rather than the idea of them. It takes something like courage to value what you actually find over what you expected to find, and to hold to that valuation when the community around you says the price is too high. Most people don't do it, not because they're cruel. Most of the people in Red Hollow were not cruel, but because it's easier and safer to see what everyone else has seen, to assess by the categories that already exist, to wait for consensus before you decide what something is worth. Colt Mercer didn't wait. He looked, and he saw, and he decided. And in deciding, he didn't just find Mara. He found out what he was willing to be, which is maybe the more important discovery. The one that stays with a person. The evening went fully dark. The coyote had moved on down the creek. Inside the ranch house, a lamp was burning in the window, and the light it threw onto the ground outside was small and specific, the way all real light is. Not illuminating everything, just enough to see by. Which, in the end, is all anyone ever gets. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, it's exactly enough.